All right, continuing here in 21, talking more about blood flow and changes to that flow. So if we look at the dynamics of that circulation, so it's important, three kind of main parts that determine that. So we have what's called blood flow, we have blood resistance, and then the blood pressure. So these are the control mechanisms that regulate the pressure and the flow. So what are each of these? So starting with blood flow, that is the volume of blood that is flowing through the vessels. So this is very variable between different organs or at different parts. But again, the amount of volume that is flowing through that is considered our blood flow. So the amount of water coming in or out changes that flow. Then the blood pressure, of course, we hear a lot about blood pressure, but this is the force per unit area that's exerted on the walls. So usually referred to the systemic arterial blood pressure. And then we also have the resistance, and the resistance is going to be that opposition to flow, so preventing it from flowing through there. So the flow is the volume, the pressure is the force that's being exerted, and resistance is pushing against that. So it's the amount of friction the blood encounters. And that's determined by the viscosity, so how thick the blood is, the length of the vessel, and the diameter of the vessel. So with the resistance, if we look at each of those, so again, the viscosity, this is that internal resistance that's talking about the thickness of the fluid. So how much water is in it? Is it thin blood? Is it thick blood? But if we have a lot of viscosity, if it's really thick, then we're going to have more resistance. It's going to be harder to move it through. If we look at the length, the longer the vessel is, the more resistance that it's going to have. So there's miles and miles of extra small vessels. So that's going to have more resistance. So it requires more force to push that through. And then with the diameter, the smaller the diameter, the greater the resistance. So that's where we think about the difference between the arterioles and the arteries, where the arteries have a wider diameter, it has less resistance than those arterioles. So the major determinant of that peripheral resistance, so whenever we're talking about these small, since those arterioles can dilate and constrict, the major determinant there is going to be that diameter. So the laminar flow, and then we also have turbulent flow to distinguish here. So laminar flow is streamlining. This is a constant relative speed of the fluid, and then turbulence. So if we think about turbulence in an in an airplane where it's kind of jumpy, this would be irregular blood flow. Whenever we get the mixing of fluids, then this is what happens with atherosclerosis, where we have an increased resistance because it can't move smoothly through there. It has a more turbulent flow. Now, what is the relationship between those three factors? The flow, the pressure, and the resistance. So flow here indicated by F. Pressure is P. The delta here just means the difference or the change in blood pressure between 2 points. And then that peripheral resistance. And you can see here that the flow equals the change in the pressure divided by the resistance. So the resistance is going to be the major influence for most local flow, since again, those arterioles can change or dictate the radius, the diameter of those vessels. So now if we look at kind of the physiology here, so if we look again at this cross section here, so as the diameter of the vessel decreases, then that cross-sectional area increases and the velocity of blood flow decreases. So we only have one aorta that has a cross-sectional area of about 5 square centimeters, but then the total cross-sectional area of millions of capillaries is about 2,500 square centimeters. So it just kind of puts it into perspective there. So again, we have a much greater area here in those capillaries than what we do in the aorta. So much like a stream that kind of flows rapidly, down through kind of a river, but then whenever it gets to the pond or lake, then it's going to smooth out into that broad plain. Right, so then we also talk about our pulse pressures. So this is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures. So this is going to increase when the stroke volume increases. So again, the more blood that we have moving, or vascular compliance, so just the elasticity decreases. And that happens with age. Also, arteriosclerosis, that's different than atherosclerosis. But as those arteries start to break down, then the pressure is going to rise. That's going to increase that pulse pressure. It can be used to take the pulse to determine our heart rate and rhythmicity. So again, is it that nice lub-dub kind of, or is it beating very quickly or slow? And the most frequent sites, though, that are measured is at the carpus of the radial artery for that radial pulse. So right there, again, right at the wrist, at that radial artery, that's the most common pulse pressure that's determined. But as you can see in the figure here, there are others as well. All right, now if we look at the blood pressure of these vessels, so as the blood moves from the aorta and large elastic arteries that have a greater difference in the systolic and diastolic. So again, here if we're looking at the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures, at the aorta, which is the largest diameter, we have a huge difference. So about 120/80 is kind of normal. However, as we get smaller and smaller in diameter, when we get down here to our arterioles, that difference is going to be much less. And then by the time we get to capillaries and then our veins, there's no difference in that pressure between the systolic and diastolic. So it's going to drop to 0. So if we look at that arterial blood pressure, that's going to depend on the elasticity of the arteries. So again, how elastic, how much can they move and extend, and then the volume of the blood that's being forced through there. So if we kind of map this out, so that left ventricle is going to contract. That's going to allow the blood to enter the aorta. So now the aorta expands. So again, thinking about elasticity or elasticity. So it's going to expand to accommodate the blood. That's the systolic pressure. Then it's going to recoil. It's going to go back to normal. It's going to relax, which is the systolic pressure. And then the blood's going to enter the arteries. The arteries are going to expand. Then they're going to recoil. So again, at the aorta and those arteries, we're going to have a difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. But as we get more into the thinner layers, they're not going to be as expanding as much. So then we're not going to have much difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures. So again, since the pressure in the aorta is greater than the pressure in the arteries and arterioles, that's going to be the reason that it flows in one direction. So it doesn't go from an arteriole back to an artery because the pressure difference is in the wrong direction. It only can move from a higher to lower pressure. So then our pulse pressure is just the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. So again, we want to make sure that we're at one of those larger arteries so that we can determine that pressure. And then our mean arterial pressure, the map here, that's the pressure that propels the blood to the tissue. So it's roughly equal to the diastolic plus about 1/3 of the pulse pressure. So we take that diastolic pressure and then we add the pulse pressure 1/3 of that. And that gives us the mean arterial pressure. So that map and that pulse pressure decline as blood flows away from the heart. So as we get closer, so it's easier to feel that carotid pulse than the pedal pulse. So again, the farther away from the heart we get, the less pressure we're going to feel. So it's hard to detect it. Whereas in the carotid, we're much closer to the heart than we would be in the foot. And if we look at the blood pressure of the capillaries, the precapillary, just to put it, again, these are not numbers I would ask you, but it's about 35, and then it drops to about 15. Again, always going from a higher to lower in the postcapillary. And we want a low pressure here because if we had a high pressure, then it would rupture those really thin capillaries. So it needs to be moving pretty lightly, not a lot of pressure there, otherwise they would just pop and expand. And also it allows the fluids to enter the space. If it was just pushing them out, they wouldn't have time for that diffusion to occur. Then if we look at the venous blood pressure, again, it's about 15, so it's about the same as those arterials or coming into the capillaries. And again, it's fairly steady. It's not pulsated, so we're not going to get a pressure, pulse pressure there because we're not getting a difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures. So this pressure, though, is too low to promote venous return. So again, it's not going to want to flow back to the heart. So we rely on the respiratory pump and a muscular pump, as well as those smooth muscles around the veins to pump the blood back to the heart. So the respiratory pump, this here is what we get whenever we inhale. That increases the abdominal pressure that squeezes those veins, forcing it back to the heart. So then whenever we inhale, it decreases the chest pressure. That causes the thoracic veins to expand and allows the blood to go back or into that right atrium. Then our muscular pump, this would be skeletal muscles around the deep veins that need to contract and relax to push the blood back to the heart. And then finally, the smooth muscle layer around the veins constrict during that sympathetic control to allow for venous return. So if we look then at the capillary exchange and regulation of that volume, so that exchange is just the movement of substances in and out of that capillary network. Again, it's by diffusion. It moves from a high to low state, but only lipid-soluble substances can cross there. So not everything can just move across the membrane. But lipid-soluble molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, small hormones or fatty acids that dissolve in lipids, not water, that can cross that plasma membrane, they can move across. Now, water-soluble substances, though, they're going to move through those fenestrations of the capillaries. So again, those fenestra that occur, that would allow glucose and larger things that like water to move through. So then the blood pressure and the capillary permeability as well as osmosis affect the movement of that fluid. And it comes out of the capillaries at arterial ends, and most, but not all of it, returns to the capillaries and the venous end. So we're not really losing a lot of fluid there. So again, it kind of means that the tissues remain about the same. So it's picked up by the lymphatic system that we'll be covering in the next chapter, and then it returns it back into the venous circulation. All right, so if we look now at the pressures there at that capillary exchange. So first we have the NFP, the net filtration pressure. Excuse me. And this is the force that's responsible for moving the fluid across those capillary walls. So we have the two pressures, hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure, that are driving these. So hydrostatic pressure is the physical pressure of the blood moving through the vessels in the fluid. Now the osmotic pressure is going to be the movement of solutes. So as we change the amount of ions or glucose or molecules dissolved in the fluid, that's going to either increase the desire of water to come in or out through those capillary exchanges. So the amount of solutes determine the osmotic pressure. Just the physical pressure of the blood moving through is the hydrostatic pressure. So then we calculate that by taking the net hydrostatic pressure and subtracting that from that osmotic pressure. And that net hydrostatic pressure can be calculated by subtracting the capillary hydrostatic pressure from the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. So the difference between those two gives us our overall hydrostatic pressure. And if we look at the osmotic pressure, we have the BCOP, which is the blood colloid osmotic pressure, and then that ICOP, the interstitial fluid pressure. So the difference between the osmotic pressure of the blood and the osmotic pressure in that interstitial fluid outside of the blood determines the overall net osmotic pressure. All right, so if we look at how fluid moves across the walls of the capillary, it's all based on that osmotic pressure and the hydrostatic pressure. Sorry about that. So if we start here at the arterial end, what's going to happen here is as blood flows through this, what's going to happen at the arterial end is that the osmotic pressure is lower, and then the hydrostatic pressure, so just a regular high blood pressure, the hydrostatic pressure is higher. So again, everything is going to move from a lower pressure to a higher pressure. So because of that higher blood pressure, that is going to cause blood to flow out of the capillary. Then on the other side of the capillary, on the venous end, we have the opposite happening. So the osmotic pressure is high, but the hydrostatic pressure, or regular blood pressure, is low. So because of that, that's going to cause, that osmotic pressure is going to cause the water to come into the capillary. So blood is going to flow out at the arterial end because of that high blood pressure, low osmotic pressure, and then it's going to come back into that capillary on the venous end because of the opposite, the higher osmotic pressure and the lower hydrostatic or blood pressure. All right, so then how do we control the blood flow in these tissues? So locally, so that local control, most of the time it's proportional to the metabolic needs, meaning if we need a lot of oxygen in a cell, then it increases the blood flow. If there's not a lot of oxygen or nutrients needed, then that blood flow is going to decrease. So it's based on what the cell needs. So if we need a lot of nutrients, increase blood flow, not so much, we can decrease it. Now there is also control by the nervous system. So this is the routing of blood flow and maintaining the blood pressure is what the nervous system is going to do. So we can release neurotransmitters that increase or decrease blood flow and allow for that blood pressure. So vasoconstriction or vasodilation. And then we also have hormonal control. So in addition to neurotransmitters, we also have hormones that have sympathetic action. So they act like neurotransmitters from our sympathetic nervous system. But again, they're hormones. And what those hormones do is they stimulate those neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's just instead of it being a signal from the brain, it's a signal from a hormone. All right, so some of the characteristics here of our capillary beds. So some of the local factors here, like a vasodilator, this is going to regulate those meta-arterioles. And again, those are branches, so the arterioles come in, and then they're going to branch off into that capillary net. Well, that branching off into the capillary are those meta-arterioles. And then those precapillary sphincters that are, again, that control mechanism, kind of like a rubber band that can squeeze or relax to control the flow. So those are going to regulate the meta-arterioles and those sphincters. Then the cyclic fluctuation is due to vasomotion. And this is a periodic contraction and relaxation of the sphincter. So again, kind of like that rubber band that can squeeze or relax. But this is due to the needs of the tissue. So again, if the tissue needs a lot of oxygen, we want to increase the flow, that sphincter would relax. If it has enough oxygen or other metabolic needs, then it can constrict to decrease that blood flow through that capillary bed. So a lack of nutrients can also result, again, in increased blood flow, again, trying to provide those nutrients to the tissues. And then there's also some auto regulation. So that arterial pressure can change, whereas the blood flow is pretty well constant. So again, pressure like vasoconstriction or dilation, that changes a good bit. However, blood flow to tissues is pretty well the same. And so the maintenance of that blood flow is because of this auto regulation. So while, again, pressure fluctuates, blood flow kind of is self-regulated. So the mechanisms are based on that vasomotion. So the metabolic needs of the tissue are what are going to control that. So again, the need of oxygen and nutrients is going to cause those sphincters to dilate so that more blood flow is coming in. And then once the needs are met, the sphincters are going to constrict, so that decreases the blood flow even if the pressure is high. So it can regulate it even in spite of the blood pressure. So some long-term kind of blood flow. So long-term regulation is matched really with those metabolic needs. So again, the brain needs a lot of oxygen, so there's a lot of blood flow going to the brain. The relationship, though, can cause capillary densities to change. So again, the blood flow we kind of regulate, so it increases capillary beds. So again, the brain, because it needs a lot of oxygen, has a lot of capillary beds. There's a lot of that's very dense, lots and lots of capillaries in the brain compared to, say, like adipose tissue that's relatively kind of stable and constant storing the blood. It doesn't need a lot of capillaries. So again, that oxygen availability is the main thing that's going to determine those metabolic needs, is the desire and the need for oxygen. So if the needs are high over an extended period, the diameter and number of those capillaries increase so that we can get more blood flow going to that area. And again, looking a little bit more closely at the nervous control. So this is kind of that minute-to-minute regulation, not so much long-term, but quick regulation. So it provides a means that blood can be shunted from a large area to another area by increasing resistance. So we can control the flow to a particular area. Now, the sympathetic division of the nervous system is the most important here. Again, we think sympathetic is our fight or flight. So those vasomotor neurons are also called vasoconstrictor fibers, but these innervate all the vessels except for the capillaries, the areas around it, like the sphincters and those meta-arterioles. So again, most of the sympathetic neurons are what are coming into those vessels. So then that vasomotor center is in the lower pons and the upper medulla. So think about the brainstem here. And the excitatory part is tonically active to cause that vasomotor tone, mainly controlled by norepinephrine. The inhibitory part causes vasodilation just by decreasing the sympathetic output. So it's not so much another system, it's inhibited by decreasing the amount of activation. Right, so then that sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal medulla causes an output of norepinephrine and epinephrine. So this is kind of the adrenal medulla is also going to be important in our endocrine system. But again, it's stimulation there of that region increases norepinephrine and epinephrine, and that causes vasoconstriction in the vessels except skeletal muscles, where vasodilation happens. So they're both adrenergic receptors because norepinephrine and epinephrine are binding to them, but with alpha adrenergic, it's causing constriction. With beta adrenergic, is causing dilation. So even though it's the same neurotransmitter, the cells respond to it differently because the receptors are slightly different. So this constant sympathetic stimulation results in a continual state of constriction called vasomotor tone. So there's always some type of constriction going on, which is the vasomotor tone of that vessel. And then again, just kind of capping this up or recapping this a little bit. Again, here's our sympathetic chain. So we have these sympathetic nerves, fibers that are going in and innervating our vessels, both the arteries and the veins. Again, most of the pons and the medulla oblongata is controlling and causing the release of that epinephrine and norepinephrine.